Alright, so this is a demo for um, the one-page alternate history comic, and this starts with just me sketching out my ideas for the comic. I came up with a few different ideas for a topic, looking at the BBC timeline, like the moon landing, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, uh, which we think of as like a staple of the American government, but is a pretty recent addition. But anyways, the impeachment of Donald Trump, um, and then the change in the United States news media over uh, the past decade or so, or couple of decades. Uh, it's more than that. It's about 40 years. Because or like you could call this event, if you wanted to call it an event, as opposed to a long period of time where we saw a lot of changes. Um, you could call it uh, the end of the Fairness Doctrine, which happened in the late 1980s, and the Fairness Doctrine, uh, which I was already pretty familiar with before I decided to research it further, um, is what happened to it? It's not around anymore. That's because the FCC, or the Federal Communication Commission, faced a lot of external and internal pressure to remove the or to do away with the Fairness Doctrine, which regulated the news. It required, among other things, it required a broadcaster to be fair. Kind of self-explanatory, but it required a broadcaster to share multiple different perspectives on the stories that they covered. So eventually, the FCC caves to this pressure, and they abandon the policy, which really led to how things are now, with like Fox and CNN and NBC, the cable news networks, being really divided and presenting very different takes on a lot of the same stories, um, kind of between each other. So as a whole, if you consumed them, you might be able to get a glimpse of what one news network looked like 40 years ago. So, anyways, that story really spoke to me. Uh, so then I sketched out ways for how I wanted to communicate that story. I go with the second idea I came up with, which has the Capitol building and Ronald Reagan, and kind of some more literal imagery and some more imaginative imagery. But I'll talk about that a bit later. Um, so I decided to go forward with the second one while I'm drawing or sketching it out. I come up with the different changes I want to make. Um, I get this idea of kind of maybe moving a panel aside, so I make that note to myself. And then I'm going ahead with penciling. And the first thing I do is to rule out the panel borders. I have in my head an idea of how many panels I want. I'm using a 9-panel grid. You'll notice there aren't actually 9 panels. There are 7 panels, but you'll notice the top row has 3, the bottom row has 3, and the middle row is roughly as tall as the top and bottom rows. And so kind of this idea of like your comic page being laid out in a way that somebody could like draw a grid on top of it is a pretty classic format for comics. And it's not very dynamic, but that it still adds a kind of like cold, distant, static tone. It's very still, which will kind of create a fun contrast when I add color later on. Really like bright, vibrant colors. But now I'm moving on to the actual penciling, which is the fun part. And my very first panel, is a drawing of the FCC seal, which I used reference for. It's not the exact seal, but it's pretty close. And that kind of compounds the idea that when I'm doing research, when I decided on my topic, and then I went to JSTOR, which is a database that has a really wide variety of scholarly sources, and I found a chapter from a book that talked a lot about the Fairness Doctrine, and kind of charted how that had an impact on American history. So when I was doing that research, I was also thinking about what imagery came up and what I wanted to draw. And I started like filing those away in my head to thinking, okay, I should find a reference for the seal, or Ronald Reagan, or the Capitol building. But yeah, reference is important. The imagery in my comic is, you'll notice that the images aren't really in a sequence. And Scott McCloud, who literally wrote the book on comics, it's called Understanding Comics, by Scott McCloud, describes a few different relationships between the panels in a comic, or different kinds of relationships you can have. Some are more like stop motion animation, or film reels, or flip books, where you can kind of see, like, let's say Captain America's punching the Red Skull. You'll see Captain America like pull back and launch forward, and his fist will move until in each panel getting closer and closer to like the Red Skull's face. But there's other kinds of imagery, like non sequiturs, where they aren't in a sequence, like I said earlier, and they might not even be related to each other, and that also can create a more distant or like esoteric tone, which again I think is kind of an interesting contrast with my like early bright vibrant colors that I had later on. So I'm still penciling. You'll notice I used a little dish to get that circle, and I'm creating these lines that I use to try to make sure everything's symmetrical and try to line everything up with each other. I really try to like measure out these aspects of the seal, because it's very geometric, it's very clean, it's graphic, and I want to kind of get that quality across, especially because in my other drawings they're more looser, they're more naturalistic, so you want that tone. After completing this first panel, I guess doing the little lettering in the text, it made me feel like doing more lettering, so I kind of move on to that. And that's pretty scatterbrained. I start penciling, and then I decide, oh, I better start lettering. But it reflects how important lettering is to this entire process. You don't want to have to draw everything and then run out of space, and then come back and redraw your beautiful drawings just because you didn't leave room for lettering. And so having to go back and create room is not fun. So you really want to know where your lettering is before you start really committing to any of your pencils, and especially before you start inking. There's this idea in lettering, or letterers will, sorry, not letterers, pencilers will always do a little bit of lettering, or at least they should, before they start drawing, just to try to think of You know, how much space in a panel do they want to fill up? How much space on the page are you leaving to make room for the text? Is it going to be able to breathe? If you've got a lot of text, you're going to want to make room and have a lot of empty space in your drawing. If there's not a lot of text, you don't want to leave these like blank areas where the reader's eye can just kind of sit and like stagnate. Your lettering also has to be legible. When I was ruling out my comic, ruled a lot more lines than just the panel borders. Part of this was to help me with my composition and trying to line certain things up. And part of it was lettering and how it helps to rule out each line. I didn't do that with all of the lettering I did. And you can kind of see where like there are areas where it gets a little wobbly. And kind of the part where I slowed down here, you can see me kind of spin out of control and literally, you know, like even having these lines, my text just kind of curves downward or upwards, and I have to erase it and go back. So you really want to be using these tools at your disposal, like that dish to get that circle, and the ruler to get these lines. Yeah. I I actually don't script out my page before I start penciling the text. Um, I kind of write on the fly, and that's not that uncommon for artists who write and draw their own comics. When you're doing more detailed thumbnails or like rough drafts of your comic page, as opposed to a few sketches, usually that's when you can do the writing and brainstorm what your comic's gonna say. Uh, but when you don't have that, um, it's even on the page. I find that I can write in, and my script will change depending on how much room I have. But ultimately, I'm able to say what I wanted to say kind of before I put anything down on paper. Um, so I've got the lettering in at this point, and I'm getting back to the drawing. And this is the part of the process that really makes me think about play. Writing is fun. You get to be a little silly sometimes or really serious. Um, and coloring is fun. Everybody loves coloring. Uh, but like drawing and imagining what the comic is going to look like, to me, is so much like playing with Legos or playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, where my friends and I are improvising a story, and you have an idea of what you want to do. You've got a topic, you've got kind of your ideas down on paper. So all the pressure is off, and you just get to explore, and you get to like flesh these ideas out or come up with new ideas and figure out how to portray those. Um, so it's a really great part of the process. Um, but the imagery in my comic, I've got the FCC seal, I've got the Capitol building that shows up in multiple different panels, usually from the same point of view. Then I've got a portrait of Ronald Reagan. And I use reference for all of these, but and the architecture in my own time, I've just the Capitol building, even before the uh, violence and the rioting that we saw in the Capitol building earlier this year. I've just, for some reason, drawn a lot of scenes in Washington D.C. in my own comics that I do for fun. So it wasn't. It was easier to kind of pull that off the top of my head. But using reference definitely helps make it look more real and not just like a cartoon. I think it lends some kind of sense of like seriousness or real architecture. So now I'm moving on to the portrait, or the Ronald Reagan portrait, and I used reference, uh, like I did for the seal and the microphone and the Capitol, but I tried not to just redraw one specific image. And that's a big part of portraiture, especially if you're doing commercial portraiture. You don't want to just redraw a photo that somebody took, because that photo might be copyrighted, and someone might own it, and then that gets you into some pretty dubious waters if you're reproducing something and selling it. But even still, you want it. It'll sometimes look more natural if you try to just identify the key elements of somebody's face, uh, study it, learn what those are, and try to reproduce those. That'll sometimes look more organic than just trying to redraw a photo that you see. For Reagan, you'll notice like his mouth kind of opens on one side of his face when he smiles. There are very specific bags under his eyes. He's got arched eyebrows. His hair is styled in a very specific way. Those kinds of things. He's also, and kind of doing historical fiction, and especially with these like basically political celebrities like Reagan. They've been depicted a lot in a lot of different media, and so there you might have seen different caricatures of Ronald Reagan, like him drawn in certain comics or cartoons, or even like actors playing them in movies, and you see what kind of makeup they do to the actor, or the makeup they apply to the actor to try to capture that Reagan's presence. If you're drawing someone but you haven't seen them in pop culture or any of the media that you consume, it can always help to look that up, and find how other people have tried to depict this figure. Moving on to inking, I used a pretty fine point pen, and that let me stay pretty sketchy. Even when doing these permanent marks, I've got a pretty loose quality to my lines, which I really enjoy. There's a kind of energy that I get for my sketches that I'll sometimes have a really hard time reproducing in the final product when I scale it up or when I do these inks. And so I was pretty happy that I kind of kept that like playful energy. That being said, I am not a great inker. It's probably the weakest part of this whole process. One of the most important parts of inking is spotting the blacks, which means you're trying to figure out how to create an interesting composition just with black and white shapes. Like if you squinted your eyes and like you couldn't see faces or buildings or any of the subject matter in your drawing, you would still have this interesting, exciting, well-balanced composition of just like black and white shapes. And it really embraces those elements of design, of like thinking about how those shapes relate to each other, how they can create depth, interpenetration of value, things that can create like movement or a static feeling. You want to be thinking about that stuff, because in a comic there are like 3 layers of a composition. You've got your pencils, which are maybe like the least important. You've got your inks, where you're creating these shapes of value, and then you've got your color, where you're creating shapes of color. And all three of those compositions have to, you have to think about those. If you're being more literal about your coloring, which was kind of a trend for a while in comics, mainstream comics, people would go back and recolor old comics to be more literal, meaning like looking at somebody's face, it'll be a skin tone, and like a purple coat will always be a purple coat. But the ideas of like using different colors and like maybe using a limited color palette, and like maybe in some panels like a face is going to be red, sometimes the face is going to be blue, and you can still tell it's the same face because it's drawn the same way, and maybe you're using a similar temperature of color. But getting back to inking, that was a tangent. You want to be thinking about spotting your blacks, but then inking is also an important part of the process. Or sorry, the tracing element of inking, going over line work. A good inker, and you're inking your own work, so you really want to be a good inker. But a good inker always adds something to the pencils. They're maybe doing a little bit of improvising. Maybe they're on a very technical level, you're redrawing a hand that looks a little bit off. Maybe they're adding, the sense of value or a value structure, and using hatching or cross hatching or screen tones to build depth and complexity on top of the line work. You don't want your inks to be reductive or to take away and to like oversimplify the line work. There's a very famous comic book artist named Jack Kirby who had a very specific style, but he did so many comic books that he worked with a lot of different inkers. And you can tell when looking at his comics who inked what, because there are some inkers that would take Jack Kirby's really detailed pencils and omit entire characters, or simplify the clothing, or like redraw buildings so that they would be easier, or correct things that didn't necessarily have to be corrected. So that's that's an example of bad inking, maybe. And it all gets back to this idea that like inking is really important, and if you feel like it's just tracing, you might be a little bit wrong about that. Right. So you can tell at a certain point I changed pens. Some parts of I think that part of the video is really sped up, so you might have missed it. But my really nice pen that I adore, I very recently rediscovered it in one of my drawers. I've been using it a lot over the past month or so, and it's finally given out on me, or dying out on me. So I had to go to a few different other pens, and that highlighted the importance of the actual material that you're working on. I'm using marker board, and will be using marker board in the classroom, and it's really thick and durable, which means you can paint on it, but that also impacts how receptive it is to materials. And some pens will work better than other pens. with the fine point pen, you can really like dig into it, and it's more of a ballpoint, and you're really like pushing into the paper or the board to get these colors or to get those lines. But these other markers just kind of glided off. We now have finished the inks. There's a look at the completed project, and now we're moving on to coloring. After the line work is done, I let it dry for about an hour and a half, and I went back in with watercolors. First, I taped most things off, and I missed a few spots, which kind of comes up a little bit later. When I started taking tape off, and there was one area where there was no tape to take off, which was alarming. But anyways, I fixed that just with a little bit of white acrylic paint. And that was part of how I was able to do that is because watercolors are very transparent. So you can go over them with acrylics if you need to do some whiteout techniques. And you can also go over line work with watercolors. They're transparent enough that you won't block out your inks totally. And it's an effect that you can get with some like Photoshop blending modes, but this is a really old school way of doing it that works pretty well. Traditional comics colorists back in the 60s and 70s would use dyes, which were very vibrant and bright, but were pretty hard to control. But with this coloring, that's the end of the demo. The comic just is nearing completion. By the end of this, I do 3 panels, and then I finish the rest of it off screen. And the final product looks a little something like this. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned from this, or maybe just enjoyed the process.